or you have an aquarium, and then you put a fish in there, and you have to feed it so it gets big. So you get a baby, then you feed it to get big, and then after it gets big, then you get another fish, then you breed them and see like what combos you can get, and then
It sounds like the Logan Paul crypto zoo game.
well, yeah, that's what all crypto games are basically based off.
Hello and welcome to fuck me.
That was almost such a good opening.
You can probably still fit it in there somewhere. Hello and welcome to Hobbyists, a show about the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. I am Jake. This is Jake. Welcome. As you may have guessed, or maybe didn't guess, this week we're talking about, I would say, collectively our latest obsession and definitely our biggest rabbit hole obsession in terms of a hobby, Warhammer.
Yeah, at least
40K.
lately.
Definitely lately. I mean, we'll get into it, but I think for both of us, we have hobbies that we have nose dived into, but this is I am below the pool at this point.
Yeah, both monetarily and subjectively.
Absolutely monetarily, yes. I mean, I'll just come out and say it, and we'll talk about why, but 40K might be one of the best hobbies ever made because, one, how much you can sink into it, but also how many levels there are to it in terms of, you can get down bad in 40K in terms of how much money you're putting in time, or you can be up here like you're reading a book every year, and that's kind of it. But we're talking about 40K today. We're talking about all three elements of 40K according to Games Workshop, which is painting, lore, and playing, one of which we are definitely the newest to, and we'll talk about that near the end. But to start off, just talking about 40K in general, how did you learn about 40K? How did you decide to destroy your bank account with 40K? What led to this? What I've been told by many people is a terrible life choice.
Well, my origin story is honestly just a bounce off of yours. So, I had known 40K exists. Obviously, I'm really into card games and whatnot. Never really played in shops, but I knew it existed. But beyond that, that was it. I knew that StarCraft 2 was based off of 40K, and I played a ton of StarCraft 2, or StarCraft and StarCraft 2. And so I knew what it was, but had never been interested. And then one day at work, you just pulled up and you're like, "Oh yeah, I started getting into Warhammer 40K." And I was like, "Tell me about that." And that's pretty much all it takes for me to get into a new hobby is just, "Oh, I'm doing this," and I'm like, "Now I'm doing it." It's that meme where it's like, good idea, and then someone comes up next to it, grabs it.
Yep.
I had this good idea. This is my idea.
This is mine.
And so that's pretty much how I got started. Was just you pulled up and were like, "Oh, I'm doing this. I'm gonna build an Ultramarine army," and I was like, "Ultramarine sounds pretty meta. Let me do some digging." And then for the last 2 or 3 months, I think, since we had that first conversation, I've just been doing research on what faction I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to do Space Marines, but I didn't know which one. So I've just been doing a lot of research and finally settled on Space Wolves for Christmas. So what about you?
I mean, similar in that, a lot of my hobbies, someone tells me to do it, which I feel like is a weird, look into my own personality maybe. But in terms of someone telling me is more through YouTube content. Because again, I always knew 40K existed because if you go to any card shop, you see 40K or you see Star Wars Legion or any of wargaming. Type of thing. And I always knew the meme that 40K was really expensive, which is why I never really wanted to do it. And it also just, and it is a complex game, but the aspect of it being really expensive plus being really complex, that, I don't have enough time for that ever. And it wasn't until I just randomly YouTube recommended 40K lore in 10 minutes or whatever. And I think they explained how the very beginning of 40K lore. And I was like, holy shit, this is really cool. And then I started reading some more. And before I knew it, was 3-4 hours I had just spent going through wikis and stuff. I barely know anything about this universe, but I was like, this is some of the coolest lore I have ever heard for a fictional universe. And then so slowly after getting, I guess, indoctrinated into the universe, I was like, well, I'll buy a unit and then I'll paint it and we'll see how it goes. And then now we're, as you can see, really deep into this. All right, before we start talking about the very deep lore, because there's a lot of fucking lore in 40K. It's like actually mind-blowing how much stuff there is. I would be interested to know if you could give, 1 to 2 minute elevator pitch on what 40K is and why someone should care about it, because I feel like, we're deep enough into 40K where we get it, but I feel like a lot like what we were explaining earlier, where someone goes to a game store and they're like, what the fuck is this? Why would I care? I feel like there's not always a great pitch as to why someone should invest objectively a ton of time and money into something that they don't even know if they're going to enjoy.
Right. So the biggest reason to play 40K is just the depth, like you said before, of just how much stuff there is. So you have lore, you have painting and building, and then you have playing. So theoretically, you can do 1, 2, 3, or a combination of those, right? You can do just the lore, and you're just reading books on, what is Warhammer 40K and what is this massive dark world that they've built, which, if you're unaware, 40K is just incredibly dark. Everything is evil, even the Space Marines, who are supposed to be good guys, are not even supposed to be good guys. So there's a lot of lore that you can get into. Painting and building is just another art form in itself. So you can put together these guys, and you can never paint them at all if you don't want to, and you could just focus on building so you can get straight into playing. But if you're really into it, you can learn how to paint them, and you can do various different things with your army that is self-expressive. And then there's also the playing part of it, which is probably the most involved version. Granted, you can get pretty involved with paint, but it's just the most involved in terms of like you need to know rule sets, you know how armies interact with each other, and so it's very variable in how much you want to involve, and it's very different in terms of one hobby being able to I don't know, scratch so many itches.
Do you think it's overblown, the meme that people say like Warhammer is like, because like the big one's like, 40K in debt? Like, do you think it is accurate compared to other hobbies, or do you think like it's about?
No, it's definitely more expensive. Like
it's more expensive.
I'm into climbing, like rock climbing, and like $200 for a pair of shoes. Sure, like you'll drop that on a really nice pair of shoes, like super aggressive. And then you need like chalk, and then if you really want to get like meta about it, clothes, like climbing clothes, just like basically a tank top and some really like strong shorts. All in, you're talking about like $300-$400. You could do it on 125 budget, like,
and you're good for a long time.
And you're good for years.
Yep.
Like, unless you climb every day for hours every day, you're not going to wear through your shoes in the first year. Like, I have my first pair of shoes still. Granted, they're getting a little thin, but it's like that's pretty cheap. Like, I'm into Pokemon cards, but I'm not into like playing Pokemon. I'm into just collecting, and so I get to set my budget for that. And then like anime, well, it's a $7 subscription every month or whatever on Crunchyroll. So yeah, I think all in, it's expensive just to build your first army. If you're just a collector, then even that's expensive because you have a ton of paint. Because if you're just collecting, you're probably painting a lot, and it's like $6 a paint. But if you want to do every little detail, you need like 5 paints a unit. Like each different. Like I've got intercessors here. I've got my Thunderwolves. So like each of those needs at least like 5 paints a piece. Plus their weapons, plus if they've got like fur or something.
Yeah, you can definitely get down the rabbit hole.
So it gets really expensive really quickly. But also, I did not realize this until I was browsing a forum like a week ago for tournament stuff. It was like, it doesn't matter what army you pick, because no matter what, it could be the best or the worst army in that tournament or at a time. And that's just based on the constantly fluctuating rules of 40K. So you pretty much have to have like 3 armies ready to go.
Yeah, which is insane to think about. Having only been, I only own 1 army right now. So the concept of having like 2 1,000 to 2,000 point armies is
it's like wildly expensive. It's never gonna be like I'm done once you get into 40K.
Yeah,
which is great because it's like a never-ending loop of like enjoyment. But at the same time, I'm interested to see where I go, because I'm far more finicky with like how I dive into hobbies and whatnot. I'm much more like, okay, I've gotten my fill. I'm going to, find the next one. Like right now I'm starting to get a little bit more into like Tarkov again. So I'm interested where that goes for me, because I think once I finish my 2000, I'll probably dabble and like pick up little units here and there that I want, but I'm never going to go. I don't think I'll ever go into another army.
yeah, what's crazy about 40K is that in many ways it's like an IRL gacha game, or like Genshin, to where all of this is just microtransactions. Like if you consider the combat patrol, which is basically something you can buy to where, you know, for $150, whatever, that'll get you started to play 500-point games, which is basically the baseline of playing 40K, which we'll talk about in a second. But you can buy that, but then everything else on top of it's just microtransaction, and you can keep going as far as you want. And so yeah, like what sucks, and again we'll talk about it, is that the lore is so cool and there's so many cool armies that that is what pulls you in. You see somebody else has like Sisters of Battle or Orcs, and you're like, man, I really want to try that. But I agree. Like I think I'll probably just go deeper and deeper in Ultramarines, and you will eventually get to a point where you have most everything and you don't really need a whole lot more. Yeah. And so yeah, it's like a drug. You'll need your your next hit at some point. But you didn't mention it, which is the first part of 40K, which is painting and building. How has that experience been for you, both like in terms of difficulty and all that, but also like, in relation to the rest of the hobby? How much do you enjoy that process? Because it is obviously, I feel like probably the biggest part in terms of, I mean, once your army's built, you'll obviously spend a lot more time playing the game. But I feel like especially to start, like it is a time sink.
Yeah, so putting them together, it has been really fun. Like the intercessors, when I started, I knew that you were supposed to like file stuff down or like get the snubs off from the sprues. So I was like, oh yeah, I have this file that came in my army painter set that I got for our D&D campaign. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll just file these down. It'll be cool. I tore the shit out of my intercessors. Like you came and you're like, oh yeah, this might show up in the paint. And I was like, shit. So ever since we did that and you told me about like, oh yeah, I just used a utility knife. I've been using a utility knife and that's like way cleaner. And so it's pretty much just my intercessors. Maybe my wolves a little bit that are torn up, but it's not bad. Like it's not gauging them. It's just, I'm gonna have to figure out how to add some like combat damage when I'm painting. So putting together has been like a really nice activity, especially with, like I said earlier, I was playing Tarkov and there's like 30-minute queues between your scav runs are. And so while I'm waiting those 30 minutes, I just put together my pieces, put together my guys. So that's been nice to just like have a secondary activity. I've had a lot of fun putting them together, but I've been terrified of actually painting.
Painting is definitely the most intimidating part of the entire process, because like really I have friends who are also playing this back like in my hometown, and they're more scared about the building process, which is interesting to me because I feel like once you build like 2 or 3, it's not very hard. It's pretty intuitive. Everything just kind of snaps together. You have to glue things together. Again, once you've done it once, it's fine. The problem with painting is that painting, like how real painting is you can go as deep or as shallow as you want. You could, if you're looking at my Redemptor Dreadnought here, if you wanted to, you could just paint the whole thing blue, throw some black maybe on its arms, and call it a day. And that's totally fine. You actually don't even have to paint them at all.
Correct.
But one, there's like a weird emotional attachment you get to your armies, kind of. Again, just like a video game character, like that is my Redemptor Dreadnought, and I'm very emotionally attached to him because I built him and I painted him and I gave him lore in my head of how he got to this point, right? And that's one aspect of painting and building that I found really fun, is like you do get this weird bond with your little dudes. But yeah, like you can add weathering damage, you can do highlights and edge highlights and dry brushing, or you can just go really light. And that's been both entertaining for me because it gives me something to do, but it also is like mentally taxing because I've realized that I have a very perfectionist mindset with these of it's never good enough and I can always be adding on more to these guys, which I feel like over time could be a bad thing because obviously it takes long enough just to paint them and to put them together. So to add all those other elements, just again, waste time. But it definitely is the most enjoyable part, I think, for me. I think when I was talking to you about 40K to start, like I never played it up until this point. I've still not played a game of 40K, but I've had these for probably like 4 months at this point. And when I've talked to other people who play 40K, they find that kind of crazy of like, oh, well, you haven't played it yet? And I was like, well, no, like I'm enjoying doing this so much. And I feel like, especially for me and you, where I feel like 99% of our life is spent like online or looking at the screen, because all of our other hobbies, including our jobs, involve being online, whether it be, through social media or playing video games or doing whatever. And so to be able to kind of detach yourself, and I'm sure for like people who do art and stuff, it's like, well, yeah, no shit, that's like obvious. But again, for us, and I don't know how you feel, but at least for me, it is very much like I get to detach myself from this digital world and I get to go do something physical where, you know, I can be very proud of like, I put that together. I painted that. Yeah, it took me 3 hours and I was like squinting and now I have neck pain, but I am proud that I did that. I don't know if you feel kind of the same way.
Yeah, I think that's been a big part of I've gotten like really bad carpal tunnel in the last couple months. Like you and Kid have heard me complain about it a ton, but a big part of that is just because how much time I spend on the computer. So like it's still not great to like hold like a utility knife and have to get really minute, but it's a lot easier for me to just do that for a couple seconds and then put it down and then it's fine. And so like my hands, even just like my hands have gotten better because of it, because I'm just spending a lot less time on my computer or online. But in general, I definitely agree that that is a huge part of the interest to me, is just the ability to sink as much time into it. And there's no, there's almost no scaling or like using Tarkov as an example, like you have to play 100 hours to get like end game in Tarkov, and and you're constantly having to keep up with the curve, and that gets really taxing. Whereas with this, I could never play the game and I'd be fine with it because just the hobby of putting them together is fun to me. And I think that's just like the hobby mentality or the hobbyist mentality is just like, you get to decide how you want to do those things, and there is no pressure to do things a certain way. You're just you are the decider of your own choices, and so yeah, it is really cool to just put them together. And I just keep buying stuff because it is cool to see how they come together and like get more and more refined throughout the whole process, right? So I was like tearing these guys up with my file, and then I've gotten better with the utility knife, and now I'm using less ceramic or plastic glue, so it's not melting them as much. So you can definitely tell as time has gone on that they've gotten like better and better quality with the stuff I've been doing.
You're literally improving your own skills.
You're literally improving, and it's artistic, which is I think a huge part of what people don't get about 40K. You know, people constantly associate 40K with like being this super nerdy hobby, which it is. Like demonstrably, it is. But at the same time, it is an art form. Like we were talking about Squidmar earlier, and like he's a photographer who is now a full-time like painter essentially, and it's just really cool to see people's expression with the stuff that they're doing and where they take certain liberties. Like if you wanted to, I'm not quite sure how the rules work on this, but you could paint an entire army just pink, like hot pink.
Oh yeah,
and it would be basically within the rule set as long as you came and say this is what the army is. It's just a color, but you get to decide that. And I think that element of 40K is really cool. It's just self-expression.
Yeah. And like I mentioned earlier, the reason I say that 40K is like the best hobby, air quotes, is because to any of those levels, whether it be building, painting, lore, and paint or playing, you don't have to do all three. You can pick what you want to do. And like you said, if you seriously just want to paint, do models and nothing else, like you can enjoy this hobby perfectly fine. And you don't have to do the other elements. But luckily, there are other elements of 40K, and they fucking rock. That's a good question. Well, I mean, I think you have to pick your faction first, which I think is why starting with lore makes more sense, because I feel like if you're not into the 40K lore, I don't know if you would enjoy it as much.
That's true.
Because like at that point, you could go play Age of Sigmar, which is like the fantasy version of 40K. You could go play Star Wars Legion. You could play a normal wargaming.
There's Lord of the Rings. Like
sure,
you could play D&D instead.
Yeah. Understanding and liking the lore helps because again, you kind of put a lot of yourself and like energy into these things, so you might as well think they're cool.
That's what kept me out of it for the longest time. It's like Warhammer was so dark and depressing. I just didn't think that kind of lore was cool. I'm much more of like I'm gonna play like the angel protagonist, and I'm just gonna use my celestial sword to cut through. Yeah,
and we'll definitely talk about that because the Warhammer lore is interesting. But yeah, I mean, I feel like for the most part, like just start with lore, figure out which faction you like, and then just go get like you can get getting started boxes, which are just paint and like a couple of models, or if you have a little more money to spend, you could go get like a combat patrol, which basically is what you can start off with. And yeah, I mean that's probably the easiest way to just start the building and playing aspect of it, as well as getting in some lore as well. Speaking of lore, I think we can chat a little bit about this.
Yeah.
To start. Neither of us are lore experts.
No.
To understand everything in 40K is I think pretty much impossible. I mean, am I out of line in saying that 40K is probably denser in terms of just general information about its world, its characters and everything than, I mean, I would say than Star Wars. I would say potentially more than Game of Thrones. I think the biggest thing for Warhammer is just that each of the factions is so deep in of itself in terms of stories that you could, if you just wanted to do Ultramarines and only you cared about Ultramarine stories, you could spend a long time reading just about that. And there's an entire creation of the world. Virtually everything that you could think about in terms of like day-to-day life, food, religion, culture, like it is explained in 40K, which is very rare. So yeah, we are not going to explain necessarily everything about 40K. I think the more interesting thing is why 40K is cool in terms of its lore and why you may want to read it. You already mentioned it, but to me, the number one thing that I love so much about 40K is how dark it is. Grimdark, as you heard in the opener of the show, is something that is associated with 40K. I don't know if it's a direct thing that 40K came up with, but I know like when people talk about grimdark fantasy, they're usually talking about 40K. And the main thing that
it's like roguelikes or roguelites. Who came up with that?
Or like it. I don't know if it's a thing of 40K, but it's definitely associated with it the most. But yeah, so grimdark is basically the idea that everything within this universe is really it's amoral. There basically are no good guys. There's no good guys. There's not really an end in sight for the plight of all of the factions
or the story.
It's very much a story about death, conquering, bigotry, religion, power. Which is interesting because I feel like now for me, I love that stuff. I love really dark fantasy. I love dark fiction. I love things that are very morally gray. I know you were talking earlier about how that's not
really my cup of tea.
Necessarily your thing. So I'd be interested in a sec to hear like why it works for you. But what's interesting about 40K is because it is so morally gray, it's a very interesting way of looking at the universe because there's not really a main character. It's not like in Star Wars where
the Emperor.
Sure, there are characters that push the narrative along.
Sure.
But it's not like in Star Wars where you're following the Skywalkers. Yeah, you could say in Game of Thrones, like Ned Stark is like one of the main characters that really pushes the story along. There are characters like that, but from the perspective of every other faction, like for example, the Space Wolves, the Tyranids, which are basically like
the Zerg from StarCraft 2.
Yeah, they're like an alien species.
Literally.
To them, they are the scourge of the universe. They are awful. To the Tyranids, Space Marines are the worst people ever. To the Tau, the Orcs are uncivilized and terrible. To the Orcs, vice versa. And so it creates a very interesting dynamic where everything in the universe sucks and it's so over the top that it's unlike anything else I've ever read. And that's why I just find it so interesting and continuously come back to it because it's like, damn, just when you thought this faction or this part of the world is so dark, it just goes one step deeper. And it's that over the topness that I know for a lot of people it would definitely be a turnoff, but for me it's what hooked me immediately.
Yeah, it's like you watch one video on the 10 most horrifying, disgusting Tyranids ever, and you're like, oh, this does indeed get more scary. And then you also realize where Game Workshop is just prolonging their story. But I think for my end, I did a lot of research into the army I wanted to be because I knew I didn't want to do anything chaos because that's just not me.
And for quickly, I think maybe to explain what chaos is. So essentially in 40K, and again, this is like way undersimplifying it, but you have the Imperium, which you can kind of think of like, humans, mankind, if you will. Basically, they are controlled by this god emperor. You can think of it as basically just this really powerful dude who has essentially created a religion around himself. It is illegal to worship anybody else besides this god emperor, and you'll basically be executed if you're not a follower, I guess. But it follows the Imperium, if you will, and then basically everybody else outside of the Imperium.
You got orcs, you got Drakari, you've got chaos.
There's 18 total factions, so there's a lot of different people who all have like their own cultures and basically the way that they see the world. The chaos, you can kind of think, I've heard it been described as like the dark side in Star Wars. I don't know if I'd necessarily say it's exactly what it is. It's sort of like this unnamed all-being force within the universe. Basically, there is long ago, there's essentially, you can kind of think of like a crack in a dimension, if you will, that there's almost like the Upside Down in Stranger Things. Sort of. Like you have the normal world, and then you have chaos, which is beyond
everything
that.
in there is equally as fucked up looking.
Yep.
So yeah.
And it's almost, and the way chaos is explained is that all of the emotions in the galaxy, so not just from like Space Marines, but from anybody, feeds chaos and the chaos gods.
Yeah, it's basically just a massive like emotional network.
Yeah, it's basically just like a giant ball of energy, if you will. And long ago there was a tear, and chaos was able to come through this tear into the 40K universe and
the Milky Way.
The Milky Way, yes. And you can kind of think of like the chaos as like an evil force that basically corrupts you.
Yeah, but it is like the Sith, because
a little bit
in Star Wars, like, because we follow the Jedi as the protagonists, everybody is skewed to think, oh, the Sith are bad. But if you look at it from the Sith perspective, they are just Sith, right? They are just, they're choosing their way of life.
Anakin literally said that, I think, at one point.
Yeah, and so it really is like that. If you just can detach yourself from the idea that everybody needs to be a main character and everyone's the protagonist and all the protagonists need to be good guys, that's pretty much the best way to frame it in a pop culture kind of way. Yeah, I think it was a lot of digging into just going back to why I chose, or the research I did into the faction I chose. It was a lot of looking at what is evil in my perspective, again, trying to detach myself from protagonist thought, but I couldn't quite do that. So I knew I didn't want to do anything chaos. Partially because I didn't like the models.
That's a big portion of it.
The running phrase within Warhammer is play the army you like most. So just because something is good doesn't mean that you like it. It doesn't mean that it's going to be fun. And I've probably put in tens of hours on just building this section of my army so far. It's not even halfway done. I haven't even painted anything, but I'm having a ton of fun because like building this guy. He's a Thunderwolf Cavalry. He is objectively badass. He's riding a robotic or a cyborg wolf.
Yeah.
He is using a thunder hammer, and he has this really dope shield that has a skull on it. On top of that, he's a Viking, because that's what Space Wolves are.
Yeah.
So I knew that I wanted to pick an army that I thought was cool, because that's the rule. Basically, is there, if in a world where there are no rules, the sole rule is pick an army that you like the most. And so I was like, okay, I know that I don't like Astra Militarum. I'm like, I don't want to play G.I. Joe on this field. Also, it's a horde army, and if you don't know what that is, that's just like huge amounts of units, because that would take a ton of time, money, and paint. So I was like, okay, I think Space Marines are the most obvious choice here. Some faction of Space Marines. So then I narrowed it down to Space Wolves, the Dark Watch, Night Watch.
Oh yeah, the
Black Watch, something like that.
The Knights, the Grey Knights.
No. These are like the backpack boys. That they like can fly.
The Death Watch.
No. Death Watch are the specialized ones.
They're
Blood
like Angels.
No. Blood Angels were a different one.
These are so many words.
Blood
that
Angels
are
were a different
out.
one. So this was they're black. I think it's Night Watch or something like that, or Night. I don't know. I'll have to find them later. They are black. Their armor is black. They're who's the leader of each Space Marine section?
What's the Primarchs?
The Primarch. Their Primarch is alive, and he's in the game. Or at least their chapter leader is. I think it's actually the chapter leader, and he's a badass. He's really cool. He's got like long black flowing hair. Like he kind of looks like Bucky from.
I know exactly who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. He kind of looks like Bucky from Captain America. And so like I thought they were really cool. Just from a looks, they're like they're jetpacks, so they move around the field a lot, and they're just cool. And then Blood Angels or Dark Angels were another one, because I like their cloaks. And then Blood Angels were the fourth. I very quickly eliminated Blood Angels. I just wasn't as interested in them. And then the Dark Angel, so then I was at Dark Angels, this dark black army. I can't remember what they're called. It's like Black Watch or something. And then Space Wolves. And reading through everything, I was like, okay, these other two are cool, but Space Marines Space Wolves are just cool. Like they're just. They're definitely
probably the coolest of the marine chapters.
Yeah, they just have a ton of unique units. They literally ride wolves. And so it really came down to just I kind of related to their lore, like in my deep 1800s roots. Like my family's from Norway, and so I was like, cool, right? This is the most American thing to say, but like, I was like, oh, me Viking, not, but it's just cool because I could mildly empathize with them in some weird detached fantasy kind of way. So yeah, I went to Space Wolves, and I thought, if this is the army that I'm gonna spend lots of time, money, and just emotion building, I think I could just do it forever with them. Like that, I pretty much bought the first one, or I got it for Christmas, and I was like, yeah, these guys are sick. So
yeah, I wish I would have done that approach a little bit. So mine's a little opposite. Again, we mentioned 40K is really expensive, and the way I got I would say half of my army that I have right now is through a massive sale that was at a game store by me. And by massive, I mean like 70% reduction, which is pretty huge in Warhammer because you save a lot of money.
Yeah, each box, for context, like each of these boxes is roughly like $60. So for a 2,000 point army, you're going to get about 100 points. So you need 20 boxes. So 20 times 6 is it's about 1,200.
Yeah, and that is if you're just saying you're getting like normal units. If you're getting like big elite units or vehicles or whatever, very, very expensive. But anyway, so I had done the same thing where I looked and tried to figure out, and the army that I wanted was the Sisters of Battle, which are fucking sick. They're basically like space nuns, if you will, and their job is to go around and kill heretics. So basically people that don't worship the Emperor, because the Emperor in and of itself is a religion. But their whole theme as an army is basically church because they're kind of like nuns. So one of their tanks, which gets dropped from the sky in like a drop pod, is essentially a giant church organ.
Yep.
It looks like a giant church organ with treads and cannons attached to it. They basically have like these giant Bible type things which they carry around. It's really cool. It's like if Judge Dredd was like, I don't know, really religious or
their
something.
tank is easily in the top 5 for units in Warhammer.
And I remember that specifically. I think I watched a video on the Sisters of Battle, and like just all about the history. It's like, that's sick. That I want to do this whole universe because just the description of like a church organ on a tank is sick.
Yep.
But they're one of the newer units and they're really expensive.
Why are they so expensive? They're not a horde unit.
I think it's just because they're newer.
Okay.
And by expensive, they're about the same as like others, but they just don't go on sale.
Oh, okay.
Because they're new and they don't have as many units. Like Ultramarines have a ton of units because
blueberries are just all over the place. So.
Yeah, and like Ultramarines are like, it's kind of like in World of Warcraft. Like if you were to pick, humans, that's kind of the most default race you can pick from. It's not.
If there was a default button, it would be Ultramarines.
It would be Ultramarines. So they have the most units. They go on sale a lot. They're always meta just because so many people play them. They can't really nerf them. They can't buff them too much. So it's a good safe pick. And I liked Space Marines. They just weren't my first pick. But because I was able to get such a good deal on them, I picked them. But the Space Marines also have probably the most lore in the game. Like there are so many books written about Space Marines, Space Wolves 2. And so, originally I was a little sad about having to pick them. But the fact that I can read so much about my army and get so deep is really, really cool.
That is the one part about like the what are the clowns called?
Oh, the Harlequins.
Harlequins have like they're like 2
kind of
units, and they have next to no lore. They have some. Somebody's gonna come after me and be like, "No, there's these books."
I mean, compared to everything else, it's basically none. They
it's like 1%.
Yeah.
It's like they're cool, but you can't commit to them. I think that was a huge part of what was pushing me into Space Wolves was just the sheer amount of literature. It's like, oh, I want to learn more about Ragnar Blackman. There's a book about him. There's 5 books about him. There's 10 books about him. So that was really interesting to me too. Yeah,
and that's kind of what's I think interesting about the lore is that Games Workshop is always expanding it. It's not like Star Wars or Game of Thrones where there's usually constantly shows or sequels coming out that expand the lore. Sometimes 40K will go, right now it's gone a very long time without being progressed.
Yep.
So a lot of the story is just told by people theorizing and coming up with concepts and stuff. And so, again, that all plays into your unit choice of, what do you think's cool? And then, can you make stories in your head basically about what's going on with your characters? Because, again, a lot of it's just imagination because at the end of the day, it's little tiny dudes on a table. So, yeah.
Let's reset for time.
I think what would be really fun is if we ranked our favorite factions, because I already know that you have some opinions that I don't hold in terms of goated factions versus
or not
some trash
so
ones.
goated. Yeah,
we'll see.
Yeah, so we're starting first with the Aldari. These are the space elves, right? They are the elves in Lord of the Rings. They are basically Protoss in StarCraft 2.
Yeah.
And so these are your shiny elf boys. So Aldari are cool, but personally I never found them that interesting. Granted, I haven't gotten that far into the lore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give them like I'm thinking C.
I would range between a B and a C. They're cool. Again, I don't lore-wise don't know as much about them. It's kind of like I default to elves when I play like WoW and most fantasy games, so I just think naturally they're kind of cool looking. But you can always go a little bit more interesting than an elf or a human, I think. So
yeah, I think that's fair.
We'll go C.
Sure. C worse. Astra Militarum, I'm putting them in D. I think for 2 reasons. First, they are just like bitch made in the lore, right? There are some guys that are cool and they stand out, but they are like blink out of existence in the mind of Space Marines. And then 2, on the tabletop, they are just G.I. Joe. They are just like small tanks. There's just a bunch of humans running around. They're smaller than Space Marines. Like, I just don't personally find them that cool in a world of like high fantasy like this. You just have your run-of-the-mill humans. I get that they are cool in the sense of like they are just billions of humans trying to do this job that the Emperor has given them of being a soldier. But you have Master Chief, and then you have the guy that gets run over by a warthog in the first 5 minutes. So that's my take.
I would agree that from a tabletop perspective, I think they're D. I would never build this army because 1, you have to build a lot of them. And 2,
they're actually super expensive.
Yeah, they are. And they're also just like kind of boring because, again, you paint them just like normal army men. It's just like green and tan. So it's pretty boring from that perspective. And they also just have pretty normal guns. From a lore perspective, I think they're almost S tier because, again, going back to what I was saying about how dark 40K is, they have to be the most over-the-top dark unit in the whole game. Like, you mentioned it, but the whole point of the Astra Militarum is they're basically like the normal soldiers of mankind or the Imperium, right? Like the Ultramarines are like the big, beefy boys that they bring in, whereas, the Astra Militarum is people they just throw on the front lines.
They're the grunt work.
They are. And, I mean, you weren't kidding. Like, it is literally described as billions of people who essentially have no other option in life but to be a soldier. And I think I read somewhere that, like, it's the expected life of a Astra Militarum member is like an hour.
Yeah, I think I've seen the same stat.
And they use las guns, which are infamously a pretty terrible
it's like
weapon.
Shooting an airsoft gun in this.
It literally is, and the idea is just if you have billions of those, it eventually does damage versus 1 does nothing. Astra Militarum soldiers to eat, they eat something called corpse starch, which is ground up dead bodies of their fallen comrades. They don't really get to retire, and if they do retire, they basically are sent off to other planets that they have no control over. It's said that if they basically are ever cowardice, if they run away from battle, if they for some reason hesitate, even just in the moment, they're executed on the spot by their leaders or by other Ultramarines. It's said that when Ultramarines come into battle, a lot of times they just kill the Astra Militarum because they don't care about casualties. So it's just funny how
they are very funny,
awful their lives are. So from that perspective, I think they're just funny. But I totally agree. A terrible army to build, in my opinion.
Yeah. I just in a world where stuff can literally kill something by looking at it, and then these guys are shooting the equivalent of an airsoft gun. Honestly, like an air gun. Forget the little pellet. They're just. I just don't have much use for them. So, all right, on to the next one.
We can move into
Chaos Knights. Chaos Knights are pretty fucking badass. I'd say at least A.
They are pretty cool. Knights in general, for those that don't know, are basically giant hulking mechs.
They're like these, but much bigger.
Yeah. Like in a typical game of 40K, say you had like 1,000 points, 500 points. I don't know. Each of us might have 15 units, 10 units, something like that. Yeah. If you're playing Knights, you might only have 2. Because you might have 1 because they are essentially just these massive mechs that are just so powerful, which is one reason why I never considered using them because they're so expensive.
You supplement them into armies later. Like this is like I have my 2,000 point. I am looking for like a fun like pivot for some of these points, I'm going to build this guy too.
Yeah. And I don't know if you hold the same opinion. I think the chaos version, and for, again, those that don't know, there's basically like a chaos version for a lot of these factions, which is basically just the inverse. They're evil. Not really, because everybody's evil. They just have been taken over or taken by chaos.
Like, even when they were part of the Imperium, there were rivals for basically all of the different factions of the Space Marines, and then they split them, which is works great for their canonical lore, which is, of course, their intent the whole time. So I would put Chaos Knights probably an A.
Yeah. I definitely think Chaos versions of most things are cooler, which leads us to the Chaos Space Marines, which, I would put them like at B tier because, like, again, we've mentioned it. Space Marines, I think, are inherently a little boring. Yeah. They have a lot of lore, and they are cool, and they're fun to play. They are a little cookie cutter because it's just, as the name implies, they're just kind of army boys in space.
Yeah, I think B is fine. I was struggling between B and A, but I would say B is all right. All right, Adeptus Custodes. This was the army I was going to play before I got into this, and then I was like, Space Wolves are just really cool. But I think Adeptus Custodes are awesome. I know next to nothing about them. I think on tabletop they look great. I'm gonna give them an A personally, but this is with like insane bias, so I think you're.
No, I would agree with that. I think they're also pretty sick.
Okay. Adeptus Custodes, are they like janitors? Adeptus Custodes are more like Roman legionnaire. They use, so on the tabletop they have, if there's this many units for like 750 points, have that, and that's how many that's the amount of points that that's how many units they have.
They're almost kind of like guardsmen to the Emperor, sort of.
They're like the elite of the elite.
Yeah. So like if it's Astra Militarum down here, then you have Ultramarines. They're kind of like above them a little bit.
Just above them, yeah.
But they're cool.
They are cool. I think they're really cool on tabletop. So, Death Guard.
I know very little about Death Guard.
I know very little about Death Guard as well. Is this a Chaos Marine faction?
Death Guard, I believe, are Chaos.
Yeah. Wait. No, Death Guard are the elite Space Marines. Right?
Are they?
Or is that Death Watch?
I think it might be Death Watch. Death Guard, I'm pretty sure, are just a different type of unit on.
We're searching. Oh, these are
Legion.
These are Nurgles.
Oh, that's right, because they're the ones that have like. I think their whole thing is they walk around and then they basically spread disease. Yes, they're like a walking toxic.
They have a massive amount of debuffs on the tabletop. Honestly, I think Death Guard are some of the coolest Chaos Marines.
Okay, now that I remember what they look like, they are cool because their whole thing is they're like decaying, and their like insides are out. Nurgle, which is
I think A is fair.
Yeah. Nurgle, which is basically like their god that they worship, is also really cool.
He's one of the 4 Chaos Gods.
Yeah, because again, it's just about death and decay and darkness.
I can't read this one.
Orcs.
Oh.
I think orcs are C tier, personally. So,
dude, you're gonna get fought in our tournament.
I think so. My biggest problem with orcs is lore-wise, they're really cool.
Sure.
The whole thing with orcs is that, and again, just to oversimplify it, orcs basically have this trait with them where if enough orcs believe something is real,
it becomes real.
It becomes real. So I think like
it's like Dungeons and Daddies where they literally speak to the minivan and it has gas now. Like literally, it's like, oh, this is the best gun in the world. It cannot like misfire, and it becomes the best gun ever.
There's like a trait where orcs, I believe, think that the color red is faster.
Yes,
and so they paint all their vehicles red, and it literally is faster. Like if they believe a gun will shoot better, it will shoot better if there's enough of them. So like there's a bunch of cool things there. The reason I have it lower is just because they're orcs, and like I could play orcs in literally any other fantasy game.
It's kind of like Aldari. All right, I think orcs are between S and A because of that hilarious bit about literally making things into reality. So let's put them in B.
Sure, I'm down for that.
We'll meet in the middle.
Necrons. Necrons are cool. Necrons are like basically the start of the 40k universe. They have a really tragic backstory where
they're like mummies.
Kind of, yeah. They were like a misguided people that were basically tricked into having immortality in these sort of like metal skeleton bodies.
Yeah, they're like giant Egyptian tombs.
Yep.
So basically, what happened to them? They're way before the 40,000 year, where they were trying to take over the universe, like every single other unit or every other faction. They got in bed with some unsavory people or gods, basically, and those gods betrayed them. And in order to not go extinct, they entomb themselves. Now it's 40k. They're coming awake again. Tabletop, I never want to play against the Necrons because I hate their reanimate thing. I've never even played against it, but just that sounds horrendous to go against. But I think lore perspective, plus the fact that they are pretty cool, I'm thinking S. Like that whole Egyptian like entombment plus the backstory is really cool. They really set up the 40k universe. So I don't know where you put
I'm fine with S. I mean, they're kind of like, I feel like Necrons are up there with like Space Marines of like the poster boys. In terms of a lot of
the beginner box.
A lot of lore revolves around them. Space Marines and them are like, it's a pretty natural rivalry. So I'm cool with that.
I think they're S or A. I think I don't know. This is the noob talking.
So up next we have Leagues of Votan, which is the newest basically faction. I know very little. I haven't had a chance to read the lore. They're basically space dwarves.
Oh, those guys.
They look like dwarves.
There's next to no lore. Honestly, their color scheme is kind of cool. That green, that like almost like moss green. But I've never really liked dwarves. I don't think like they look very cool on a tabletop. I'm gonna put them D.
Sure.
At the bottom.
Yeah, we'll put them in D. Regular Space Marines. I mean, which is funny because it's my own army. Like realistically, I would probably say B along with the Chaos Space Marines, only because they're just not.
There's a ton of lore, but they are what they are.
They don't really stand out. Tau are cool-ish.
I'm putting Tau A.
Tau look awesome. Tau reminds me of Mass Effect, kind of.
They're Gundams.
Yeah, they're like Gundams. They're very what you would sort of expect sci-fi soldiers to look like. I think on the tabletop they have a bunch of really cool. They're very good at shooting.
Yeah. If I wasn't gonna do Space Marines or Devs Custodes, Tau is third option.
I also had Tau in my top 5.
They're just really cool, but a lot of people say don't build Tau first because they are very big pieces. So if you're not like an adept painter, you can kind of struggle to make them look good because you are essentially painting a Gundam and it's a lot of space. So until you learn how to kind of work a brush, what do we have now?
Thousand Suns.
Thousand Suns are definitely, I think, one of the coolest Chaos Space Marines.
I would probably put them in like a maybe A because I think they're cooler than.
They're also like super OP on the tabletop.
They are really good.
So at least from what I've seen recently.
Tyranids, S baby. I think Tyranids are so fucking cool looking. Tyranids don't have a ton of lore because they're just creatures and they just eat. They do have like some lore, but
they like remove lore is like kind of where Tyranids fit in this is because they are like chitinous creatures, right? They just have their shells. They don't necessarily speak, although I don't know that there aren't Tyranids that can speak. Their whole thing is like we eat everything. It's there's a guy in StarCraft 2 based off of one of their elite units where he's called Abathur, and or Dahaka. He basically just eats everything and consumes it, and then he grows like new limbs. And then Abathur basically consumes their brains, which is what these things in the Tyranid land do, and then learns everything that he needs to know about them, and then gains basically their abilities. Secreted somewhere back in the annals of lore is this crazy Tyranid, or believed to be Tyranid, that is essentially so invisible that it can go between the particles of invisibility, that if it ever comes out and shows up, it's going to be a huge fucking problem. So
yeah, that's like the general consensus with Tyranids is like if they ever, because we also don't know how many Tyranids there are in the 40k universe.
Yeah,
they kind of just
like infinite.
Yeah, and so like realistically, they're the most dangerous unit in all 40k because of what you described and their numbers.
And they seem to just have like a animal instinct to just consume and take over the unit, whereas everyone else is like, oh, we're doing it for religion, Space Marines. We're doing it for the chaos. We're doing it because we're orcs and we just want to do stuff. These things are actually just like we think of nothing else except killing things. All right, so Drukhari, Dark Elves.
Drukhari are cool. Correct me if I'm wrong, but these are like the ones who are like really into like passion, and they're like into pushing because they're Slaanesh, right?
Yeah, so these are the ones that aren't part of Slaanesh. So to my understanding, someone might fact check me, I'm totally wrong. I believe Drukhari are the things that are not quite there.
Which ones are the opposite then? Which ones are the ones that are under Slaanesh?
It might actually be Drukhari. I'm not sure.
There's a unit within 40k that is under Slaanesh, and like their lore is probably the darkest out of any lore in that they basically gave into hard.
Oh no, it is okay. I was totally wrong. Drukhari is under Slaanesh. So Drukhari, I believe, are Aldari who have basically fallen.
Oh yes, you're right. They've fallen to Slaanesh. Yes, and basically, from what I understand, if this is the correct one, their lore is cool because basically they're people that were corrupted by Slaanesh, who is the god
sex
of,
god.
It's basically a sex god. This person is essentially genderless, and they are able to seduce people with just a look.
Yep.
Chaining people up and like torturing them
they're, like,
over time,
slicing them and then letting them heal. It's basically they've built a tolerance to all of the normal sex, all the vanilla stuff, just like BDSM and whatnot, and they have moved on to I'm gonna chop off this guy's toes, and it's gonna be great for me.
But they let them live is the main thing.
Yeah.
And so like I think there's something in 40k where it's like if you are being like tracked or if you get captured by the Drukhari, it's better just to essentially kill yourself.
Yep.
Because otherwise you'll be this tortured slave for thousands of years and you will never die. They will keep you alive just to fulfill their own like weird desires. I don't know. They're from a tabletop perspective, I know nothing about them. But they're interesting from
decent.
A lore perspective.
They have a lot of like riding or like air bikes or whatever. I think they're cool. I'd say somewhere between like B and A. Probably B.
Yeah, probably B. Yeah, sure. We'll go with B.
So Genestealer Cult are essentially like zombies, but they're not. They're still sentient, but their whole thing is they can implant people with their genes, and then it basically converts normal humans into part of Genestealer Cult, kind of like a virus.
Yep. They pretty much hit one life form. That life form then spreads it to the other parts of the life form, and suddenly they control this big mass of people.
Yeah, so they sound cool probably to the average 40k fan. Genestealer Cults are one of my least favorite factions because I don't like that.
You just don't like the concept.
I don't like that exists like as a thing. I almost don't even know why. I think it's just because I view it as like unfair almost. Like it is kind of OP, yeah. Like they could just take over and they don't seem to have an ulterior motive where it's like, and I don't know much about Genestealer like lore, but it does kind of seem like they are just doing it for the hell of it because that's just what they want to do.
I believe they have some sort of religious motive.
Oh, sure.
And that they
it's Genestealer Cult, duh.
Because they are.
Oh, it's Tyrannid. Okay.
They basically, the Tyrannid Genestealers controlled them, which they go then control the people. It's like kind of a laddered system.
Right. I mean, I would say like, Drukhari are B. And then Genestealers, I'd say are like, I mean, I put them at the bottom, but
I'd say C.
Yeah, we can put them C.
Imperial Knights. This is just the version of the Chaos Knights.
They're cool, but nothing special.
Big hulking boys.
Honestly, I'd put them like. So aren't Imperial Knights like? They're just entombed soldiers.
Yeah,
is that their thing.
I mean, that's how it works with Space Marines. I don't know exactly with.
Or is that just dreadnoughts? That's just dreadnoughts.
That's like, I mean, but with most Imperium-based mechs, that's a lot of times how it works because the idea in 40k is that you're not dead until you are literally ash. Like, for example, in this guy down here, there is a soldier in there who is mortally wounded. Basically, they're pretty much brain dead, but they have a little bit pumping still in them, and so they get hooked up to this machine and allows them to keep fighting basically beyond the grave. And I think Imperial Knights are a similar concept.
They're cool, but not... I mean, they visually are very cool, but in terms of lore otherwise, I think it's like B or C.
I would put them at B, one below Chaos Knights.
That's fair. I think just in continuity, putting them along with Chaos, closer to Chaos Knights. Adeptus Mechanicus. These guys are really cool. I don't know a ton about them. Like Cam plays them. That's the guy from our local game shop. But I really don't know much about them. So
they essentially, instead of worshipping the Emperor, they worship, simplifying it a lot, but basically they worship technology.
Machine.
Yeah, and so they believe there's like there's always like a meme of like Adeptus Mechanicus are worshiping like microwaves and stuff because they're just really into technology and they believe that is what will save them. And normally you would get executed for that. But the thing about the Adeptus Mechanicus is they're very smart and they're able to, they're kind of like the engineers of the Imperium. And so the Emperor is cool with them not worshiping because they provide arms to the Imperium.
Yeah, it's pretty much gotten to the point where because 40,000 years is a very long time, lots of stuff just doesn't work anymore. And so Adeptus Mechanicus are the only group that know how to make it work. Right? Like, I think... Like the guns that Space Marines use, like without Adeptus Mechanicus, I don't think would exist. And so they're pretty much putting Band-Aids on all of this ancient technology that allows it to still function. So, yeah, I think Imperium of Man is not going to go very far without guns. No. So that's why the Emperor allows it. I'd say A.
Sure.
I think A is fair. I think I know a very small chunk of their lore, and they seem pretty cool. So. Also, the tabletops are sick.
They are really cool. They're kind of complicated, but they're fun. Adeptus Sororitas put those girls.
Sisters of Battle? That's an S for sure.
Yes. Otherwise known as Sisters of Battle. This is who we mentioned earlier. Space Nuns, basically.
Space Nuns. Yeah, their tank is super cool. They have a unit where it's like they have done some kind of like religious folly. And so now they just give them a giant sword and no armor, and they just say run. Yeah, so they also have like what is essentially like a Valkyrie, but they're in just a giant suit, like a mech suit. They're very cool. Yeah, I think it's an easy S. Game Workshop did a good job of them.
Demons as last one. This is basically just, I mean, it's spelled differently, but this is, if you imagine what a demon is, that's basically just kind of like the foot soldiers of the Chaos Realm. I don't know much about them tabletop wise. They're cool in that I think their units look nice.
They're red.
They are red. My thing with them is that like if I was gonna play something with Chaos, I would go play like a Chaos Space Marine or a Chaos Knight. I don't think I would do Demons. Demons are basically like the inverse of the Astra Militarum.
They're kind of like Tyranids. Like
they also are kind of like that.
They're just a horde army. They are small. They just run at you. Yeah, I think they're decent, but again, they're just demons. I'd put them in C.
I would also put them in C. I think that's it.
That's pretty much it. And we can get into all the different factions of chaos at some later point, but yeah, I think for noobs, we've done a pretty good job at least of putting our opinions out there.
Yeah. Again, a lot of it is based on this shit look cool, so it's an S
tier.
Which
exactly.
I feel like, as much as people want to say it's different in 40K, I mean, it's kind of a lot of it.
No, it is a huge part of it. Like again, going back to the age-old saying of like play the army you like the most. If you don't like how if something doesn't look cool, why would you play it? And so I think, if I'm gonna walk up into an army of dwarves, I'm not gonna be slinging some.
Sure.
Or if I'm gonna go up against an army of like giant mechs and Adeptus Custodes or something, I'm not gonna play dwarves. So,
well, should we talk about playing this fucking game finally?
Yeah, we should. Let's talk about playing this game.
So like I mentioned, both of us are somewhat new to this hobby.
We've never played the game before.
We've never played before, but we have been obviously dabbling in it for a while now. Playing is sort of its own giant section of the hobby, because you could be really terrible at painting, not care about the lore, but you could be really good at the playing side.
Yeah.
We're obviously not going to explain how to play 40K on here because there's 40-minute videos on YouTube that'll show you how to do that. And to be honest, I feel like both of us still don't even have a full grasp on how to play it.
I just
perfectly.
know you roll some dice.
Yeah, a lot of the game is kind of based on RNG. You're basically rolling dice to see, if I'm
basically on the RNG of RNG, essentially, because you have saves that are 4+, which is RNG, and then you roll a dice or a die, and that's RNG. So it's literally just you throw 30 dice at the same time.
It's RNG built on top of itself because, like, for example, if your Eliminator hero is going to shoot at my Redemptor Dreadnought, you would have to roll to see if that shot hit.
Yep.
And then you have to see, does it get through the armor?
Yep.
Okay. And then you have to see, does it wound?
Yep.
And then you would have to check, okay, well, it wounded me, but can my armor basically negate that wound?
Right.
And then on top of that, it's like, a unit just died. Well, now I have to roll to see if they're going to be cowardice and run away. Basically, the whole game just revolves around a series of dice rolls that lead to you either being wounded, killed, or you basically save yourself. And when you boil it down to that, it's really not that complicated.
No.
The base rules for how to do a turn are not that bad in 40K. It's a lot like Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh! Or really any other card game to where there's phases and you just have to memorize what you do in those phases. To me, what is most complicated about 40K is everything else surrounding it. So we're talking about abilities,
objectives,
characters, objectives, what things mean. Again, like in Magic, for example, like having to remember what trample means or all these other things.
Flying, there's all kinds of character traits that change how they interact.
Yeah, and that just takes a while to learn. I know, like, we're already talking about, like, oh, we're gonna have to show up with like a full pad of paper with notes written down. But I think to sort of, and this is kind of segueing to what we'll be talking about over the next couple months,
several months,
within this podcast, just as kind of a side note, is we have signed up for an escalation 40K league to not only finally play the damn game, but to kind of teach ourselves how to play. Do you want to explain what that is?
Yeah, exactly? So it started this week. We were the last 2 people to sign up for it. Me not realizing how many points and how many dollars 2,000 points is, and then you having basically a full army built. And so the escalation league is you start with 500 points, which is, for comparison, like this mech, those wolves, and then a detachment or 2 of my intercessors, just normal Space Marines. So it's not much. You really don't have much to play with. Actually, I think it's just intercessors, wolves, plus Ragnar. I don't know. It's not very many points. And then every 2 weeks, you play someone new, and the points go up by 250. So in the next 2 weeks, we'll be playing 750 points. We'll be playing against a different opponent. There's a lot of Ultramarines in the league. There's a lot of orcs. There's a lot of orcs. There's like 3 or 4 orcs.
3 or 4,
there's, I think, 2 Gene Stealers. I'm the only Space Wolves.
Every faction is accounted for. Like, there's even a Harlequin army.
Yeah, there's no dwarves, obviously, because they just came out.
I don't think there's an Sisters of Battle. Maybe.
No, I don't think so. But there's a Custodes. So yeah, there's Mechanicus isn't, but Cam has it, so he is their proxy.
It's
so
kind of there.
Yeah, so just every couple of weeks, points go up until you hit 2,000 points, full army, in, I think, April, which is where that is. There's various ways that you can score points. So the most obvious and, I guess, easy way is by winning. So you get 2 points, like 2 tournament points by winning. You also get a point if you have painted all of your characters by the time your time to play comes up. You get a point if you have based them, which is if you've not only put them on the black discs they come with, but put like land features like dirt, grass, whatever, on that to symbolize like they're actually on, a piece of environment. And then every 2 weeks, you also, or maybe it's weekly, we will vote for the best painted figures in the league. And so 3 people will get an extra point every week based on just how, if their community voted as the best. So
yeah, and this is a really cool format because, at least coming from 2 people who are new to this, it can feel kind of daunting to get into this hobby, especially because a lot of people, Warhammer's been around for 30, 40 years at this point, so most people know how to play the game. And so it's nice to have a format where a lot of noobs can basically get together and kind of figure it out with each other. So I definitely recommend it. If you're trying to get into the hobby, find something like this. There's other like that aren't necessarily like escalation format, but are just noob leagues. That's easily the best way to do it, because if you find people who are interested in 40K, you can not only play with them, but you can talk about lore, and more than likely you have something in common, because I feel like if you're super into 40K, you're a certain type of person and you would kind of get along together in that format. But the whole goal is that each week, not each week, but each episode, we'll kind of update you on our progress and how we're doing and how we're feeling about it.
Probably record some practice too, so it'll be showing up on our YouTube.
In some way. But I'm very excited about this because, again, it's just been so long that I've been painting to where it doesn't even feel like playing's part of the hobby anymore.
I know. It's always been in the back of my mind that I'm going to do it, and so I think I've been a little bit more like from the get-go, this is built to play. But I think when you were starting, it definitely felt more like, oh yeah, I just really like painting them. And from the get-go, I'm like, I have to put all these together right now because I have a tournament in 2 weeks and I have to have all these pieces ready. So,
But again, to our point that we made like 4 times in this episode, that's what's so cool about 40K. You don't have to do any of this. If you don't want to mess around with being stressed and play the game, you don't have to. And if you want to play the game with just like these basically unpainted models, you can do that as well. It's kind of the beauty of it, and why, in many ways, it kind of feels like the ultimate hobby.
Yeah, it definitely feels like it's one of the more expansive ways that you can get into just any individual hobby. And if you're someone that really likes going super deep into things and just that is your one thing and that's all you're going to hyper focus on for years, then this has all of the depth that you would need. If you're someone that doesn't necessarily want to do that and wants to be more surface level and you just are interested in it from a lore perspective or from playing perspective or even painting, like I think the best way you can do that is if you're into lore, read the books, right? There's a ton of literature that exists, like published books that are, a couple 100 pages long a piece, and just read the books. If you really want to get learn more about the tabletop side of it, you can pick up the codexes, and that's a great way to learn about individual chapters. If you're into painting, pick up pick up miniatures. Just pick up a box and do it. Buy them off of eBay. Honestly, just get unpainted models off of eBay, and just start painting. And if you're really into playing, go to a local game shop. I went last week. You were out of town, and just watched people play while I was just fiddling with taking off print marks. And it was a ton of fun just to watch them play. I'd never watched 40K before. I had never looked it up on YouTube. You were far more experienced than I was in that. And I just watched them play and ask questions, and it was really interesting just to watch strategy devolve in front of me and actually just participate from afar. So if you're interested in the playing part of it, but you don't want to commit to buying anything, or if you never want to buy stuff, but you do want to play, go talk to your game store and see if make friends, see if there's someone that will let you play their army, just even if it's one time.
Touch grass and talk to people.
Touch grass and talk to people in the most untouched grass way possible.
Yeah, go inside to do it.
Yeah.
Well, that's been Warhammer 40K. If you've made it this far, congratulations on finishing your first Hobbies episode. Achievement unlocked, if you will. Obviously, as episodes move forward, this is kind of the format we'll be following. Just talking about shit that we're into, shit that other people are into.
And how to get into it.
Yeah, and basically how to get into it. Because there's a lot of hobbies out there, and some, like 40K, can feel really hard to get into, but there's always a way that you can kind of weasel yourself in. But like you mentioned earlier, we will be doing this tournament. And if you want to keep up with that tournament and how we're doing and everything like that, where can they follow us?
Yeah, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube with various links that we'll have linked on our profile pages. And then also at our website where we'll be doing weekly or even daily blogs with a newsletter as well. So make sure you subscribe for the newsletter.
Well, this has been Hobbyists. Get out there, buy some minis, paint, and maybe go play if you're feeling a little crazy.